The Senate floor on Monday felt like a pressure cooker that has been whistling for a week straight. We are now 7 days into the debate over the Save America Act, and the rhetorical lines have hardened into concrete. Senator John Cornyn in Arkansas kicked things off by invoking the Great Bambino, quoting Babe Ruth, "It's hard to beat a person who never gives up." That seems to be the Republican mantra right now. They have made this bill their absolute legislative North Star for the 2026 midterms.
It's a fascinating choice for a primary battle because the bill itself, S 1383, hits on so many different nerves at once. On the surface, it's about requiring proof of U.S. citizenship to register to vote and a photo ID to cast a ballot in federal elections. Senator Cornyn argued that this is the definition of common sense. He pointed out that we need IDs to board planes, open bank accounts, and rent hotel rooms. So he's asking why the most important act of citizenship should have a lower bar for verification.
Cornyn really leaned into the polling data, too. He cited a Pew Research Center statistic showing 83% public support for voter ID laws, including a significant majority of Democrats. From his perspective, the opposition is essentially a symptom of what he called Trump derangement syndrome. He argued that Democrats only oppose it because President Trump supports it, rather than having a genuine concern about disenfranchisement.
That 83% figure is a powerful number to throw around, but the counter-argument from the other side of the aisle focuses on the how rather than the what. Senator Ed Markey, DMA, was particularly pointed on Monday. He didn't just disagree, he tried to rename the bill entirely. He called it the Save Your Ass Act, suggesting that Republicans are using this to distract from high gasoline prices and the ongoing war in Iran. But his more technical critique was about the documentation itself.
Right. Markey went into the numbers regarding passports. He noted that 146 million Americans do not have a valid passport. If this bill passes, a passport or a birth certificate becomes the mandatory standard for registration. Markey used a great analogy, saying that requiring in-person registration with those specific documents is like forcing everyone to use a fax machine in the digital age. He pointed out that only 6% of Americans currently register in person at an election office.
And that's where the friction lies. The bill would effectively end online and mail-in registration as we currently know them, because you can't exactly slide a physical birth certificate through a web portal for real-time verification. Senator Raphael Warnock, DGA, picked up this thread later in the day. He specifically focused on how this would impact women. Think about the paperwork trail required if you've changed your name after marriage. If your birth certificate says one thing and your current legal ID says another, the Save America Act could require a mountain of supplemental documents just to get on the rolls.
Warnock was very direct about that. He asked, "Why would you disenfranchise hundreds of thousands, millions of Americans while chasing a problem that does not exist?" He noted that it's already a federal crime for non-citizens to vote, one that carries the risk of deportation and prosecution. To him, the idea that millions of non-citizens are risking their lives and legal status to vote in a way that would swing an election defies credulity.
But Senator James Lankford, RCOK, pushed back on that problem doesn't exist framing. He brought up a specific mechanism they use in Oklahoma. He said that when people report for jury duty and tell a judge they aren't citizens to get out of service, the state then cross-checks those names against voter registration rolls. He claimed they found quite a few folks who told a judge they weren't citizens, but told the election board they were. He calls the bill a trust and verify measure.
Lankford also brought up a quirk in Arizona law that I think most people don't realize exists. In Arizona, there is a split system. To vote in a state or county election, you have to prove citizenship. But due to a court ruling, for federal elections, like voting for president or Congress, you don't have to show that same proof. Lankford's argument is, if we can figure out the logistics for a governor's race, why is it considered radical to do it for the presidency?
It's a classic federalism tension. But the debate took a sharp turn into cultural territory when Senator John Thune, RSD, took the floor. He's the one who really highlighted how Republicans are packing this bill with more than just election rules. He spent a significant portion of his time linking the Save America Act to transgender issues. He defended an amendment that would prohibit biological males from competing in women's sports, framing it as another common-sense protection that Democrats are supposedly out of step with.
Thune's rhetoric was particularly sharp on that point. He said, "What is radical is men lining up alongside women at the starting line and winning medals and trophies meant for women." By weaving together election integrity, immigration, and gender identity, the GOP is essentially creating a unified front for their 2026 platform. They are betting that the common sense label will stick to the whole package.
On the other side, Senator Maggie Hassan, DNH, framed this as an undemocratic impulse coming directly from the White House. She raised a concern that I found really interesting regarding data privacy. The bill would require states to hand over voter rolls, including Social Security numbers, to the Department of Homeland Security. Hassan asked why any American should trust their sensitive data to an administration she described as chaotic.
Hassan's point about the 3.8 million citizens who don't have these documents in their possession really puts the scale into perspective. That is 5 times the total number of people who voted in New Hampshire in the last presidential election. She argued that the bill targets people who work 12-hour shifts, veterans in rural areas, and the elderly, who may have lost their original birth certificates decades ago. To her, this isn't about security. It's about making the electorate smaller.
And yet, the Republican side keeps coming back to the simplicity of the ask. Senator Cornyn mentioned that even Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, DNY, supported similar verification for employment 30 years ago. He read from the record, where a younger Representative Schumer said a driver's license and Social Security card should be used to prove someone is a bona fide person for a job. Cornyn's question was basically, what changed?
What changed, according to the Democrats we heard from yesterday, is the context of how these rules are being applied. Senator Markey argued that the Republican focus on this bill, which covers a very, very, very rare occurrence of non-citizen voting, is a wag the dog scenario. He listed off 5 reasons why he thinks Republicans want this, ranging from protecting tax cuts for billionaires to shielding the oil and gas industry from clean energy competition.
The energy angle was a huge part of Markey's speech. He actually tied the voting debate to the price of home heating oil in Massachusetts and the war in Iran. He's essentially saying, while you're arguing about birth certificates, the American people are getting crushed at the gas pump. It's a classic legislative move. Try to frame the other side's priority as an expensive distraction from the real problems.
It's also worth noting the procedural cliffhanger here. While this debate rages, government funding for the Department of Homeland Security is still in limbo. The Save America Act has become the ultimate bargaining chip. Hardline Republicans are holding up FEMA and TSA funding until they get a win on this voting bill. So when Senator Hassan talks about the crisis of cost, she's also looking at the literal cost of a potential shutdown.
Exactly. This isn't happening in a vacuum. It's a 7-day and counting standoff that connects election law to the daily operations of airport security and disaster relief. Senator Thune ended his remarks by saying the bill is radically common sense. Meanwhile, Senator Warnock ended his by calling it a calculated effort to erect barriers. The gap between those two descriptions is where the Senate is currently stuck, with no clear exit ramp in sight.
And while the Senate remains deadlocked on the why and the how of the SAVE Act, the debate is already shifting toward the actual mechanics of the vote. We are starting to see the first signs of a coordinated counteroffensive from the Democratic wing, focusing specifically on the legacy of the Voting Rights Act. The legislative bus that both parties are trying to drive right now is S. 1383. Nominally, this is a bill to establish a Veterans Advisory Committee on Equal Access. It's a relatively straightforward, bipartisan piece of legislation. But yesterday, Monday, the transcript shows that Senator Dick Durbin, DIL, and Senator Raphael Warnock, DGA, essentially turned that bus into a high-speed vehicle, for the most significant voting rights push we've seen in years. They filed a massive amendment, SA 4753, which is the full text of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2026. It's a clear counteroffensive to the Republican-led Save America Act that we've been tracking.
It's a classic Senate maneuver. When you have a moving piece of legislation that everyone likes, like a veterans bill, you try to attach your biggest, most contentious priorities to it. It forces the other side to decide if they're willing to vote against the good bill to kill the controversial amendment. And since we have a bit more room to dig into the mechanics today, we should really look at what this version of the John Lewis Act is trying to do. It's not a simple update. It is a ground-up attempt to rebuild the federal oversight system that the Supreme Court essentially dismantled back in 2013.
You're talking about Shelby County versus Holder. That's the landmark case where the court struck down the coverage formula, the list of states and counties that had to get federal permission, or pre-clearance, before changing their election laws. The court's logic then was that the formula was based on 40-year-old data and didn't reflect current reality. This new amendment from Senator Durbin seeks to fix that by creating a practice-based pre-clearance system. If you look at the record, it lists specific actions that would trigger federal review, regardless of where you are in the country.
Right. So instead of just saying Georgia and Alabama are on the list, it says if you want to do X, Y, or Z, you have to ask the Department of Justice first. And those triggers are very specific. Changing the boundaries of an electoral district, reducing multilingual voting materials, or moving a polling place in a way that affects certain demographic groups. It even covers something as granular as prohibiting the provision of food or non-alcoholic drink to people waiting in line to vote. It's an attempt to anticipate every strategy that has been used at the state level over the last decade to tighten ballot access.
And the legal standard they're proposing is quite high. I want to read the specific language from Section 101 of the amendment, because it really lands on the core of the debate. It says, a violation of subsection A for vote denial or abridgment is established if the challenged standard, practice, or procedure imposes a discriminatory burden on members of a class of citizens, meaning that members of the protected class face greater difficulty in complying with the standard, and such greater difficulty is at least in part caused by or linked to social and historical conditions.
That "at least in part" phrase is what the analysts are going to be arguing about for months. It lowers the bar for proving discrimination compared to some recent Supreme Court rulings like Brnovich, which required a much more direct link. It also codifies the totality of circumstances test. That's a deep dive legal term, but essentially it means a judge has to look at everything: the history of discrimination in the area, the degree of racial polarization in voting, even the local employment and health statistics, to decide if a new voting law is fair.
Wait, I want to take a detour here into Senator Durbin's other filing, SA 4752. This one is fascinating because it feels like a direct response to the Republican argument for the SAVE Act. While the SAVE Act wants federal agencies to verify citizenship for state voter rolls, Durbin's amendment proposes what he calls a privacy firewall. It states, the federal government shall not access the personal private information of any individual as contained in the voter registration records, databases, or other similar information of any state. It's a total block on federal agencies reaching into those state-run databases.
That is a brilliant bit of procedural jujitsu. Think about it. Republicans are arguing for more federal verification to prevent non-citizen voting. Durbin is saying, fine, but the federal government shouldn't have a giant master list of every voter's social security and driver's license number. It frames the Democratic position as the one protecting privacy and states' rights, which is usually the Republican home turf. It's a very tactical move to make the SAVE Act's implementation nearly impossible from a data-sharing perspective.
He also took aim at the costs associated with these new state laws. SA 4751 is a one-page amendment that specifically targets what he calls a poll tax. It prohibits the federal government from imposing any precondition to vote that requires the payment of a fee for documentation to prove identity or citizenship. If a state requires a specific ID that costs money to get, and the federal government supports that requirement, Durbin is arguing that's a violation of the 24th Amendment.
And let's not overlook Title II of the larger John Lewis Act filing. It's called the Election Worker and Polling Place Protection Act. This is a huge priority for Senator Warnock. It creates federal criminal penalties for anyone who uses force or threats of violence to interfere with poll watchers, election officials, or even the vendors who provide voting machines. We've seen a massive spike in reports of election workers being harassed, and this is an attempt to put the weight of the Department of Justice behind their physical safety.
What's interesting about the timing here is the context of the 2026 midterms. We're sitting in March, and the 60th anniversary of the original Voting Rights Act is coming up this August. By filing these now, Durbin and Warnock are setting the stage for a summer-long debate. They are effectively saying to the Republican majority, if you want your veterans bill, you have to talk about voting rights first. It moves the conversation away from the DHS shutdown and forces a direct confrontation on the legacy of the civil rights era.
I'll play devil's advocate for a second, though. Does this actually have a path to 60 votes? The transcript shows no Republican co-sponsors for these amendments. Senator John Thune, RSD, has already called the SAVE Act radically common sense, while he views the Democratic counterproposals as an unconstitutional federal takeover of state elections. So, while it's a great strategic move to grab the microphone, the procedural reality is still a brick wall. We are seeing two completely different visions of election integrity colliding on the floor of the Senate.
It's a total deadlock. On one side, you have the Republican push for more documentation and federal verification through the SAVE Act. On the other, you have this Democratic push for federal oversight and privacy firewalls. And neither side seems willing to blink, even as the Department of Homeland Security funding clock keeps ticking. The irony is that while they are arguing over the future of the American ballot box, the immediate economic reality for many Americans is starting to sour the mood in a different way.
Exactly. You can debate the totality of circumstances in a voting district all day, but for the person driving to that polling place, the most immediate circumstance might be the price on the sign at the gas station. Which leads us to a shift we saw late yesterday afternoon. The growing gap between this high-level strategy and the kitchen table issues that are starting to dominate the non-voting part of the record.
The $4 gallon and the strategy gap. If you look at the national average for a gallon of gas exactly 1 month ago, it was $2.93. Yesterday, Monday, March 23rd, the record shows that number hits $3.94. It is a massive jump in a very short window.
$1.01 in 30 days, to be precise. That shift is casting a very long shadow over the Senate floor right now. Having the space to look at the specific timeline of these statements helps clarify why the room felt so charged yesterday.
The transcript from Monday shows the conversation shifting from the tactical movements in the Middle East to a much more fundamental question. Is there actually an endgame? Senator Chris Murphy, DCT, was particularly vocal about the lack of a roadmap.
Murphy's argument is that the administration is essentially improvising. He pointed to the conflicting messages coming out of the White House. One day, there are threats to strike Iranian power grids, and the next, there are claims of diplomatic progress that the Iranians immediately deny.
He didn't mince words about that inconsistency. He said, and I'm quoting the record here, instead of giving the American people a clear plan for how to move forward, the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, continues, unfortunately, to flail.
Using a word like flail in the Congressional Record is a specific choice. It reflects the frustration over what some members are calling strategy by tweet. But it's not just the words, it's the physical cost. We're seeing reports of a failed Tomahawk missile strike that hit an elementary school, with casualties reported near 175.
That tragedy is fueling the demand for accountability. Senator Adam Schiff, DCA, is now among those calling for cabinet members to provide sworn testimony. They specifically want Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and Secretary of State Marco Rubio to answer for the strategic gaps under oath.
And that's where the friction lies. Majority Leader John Thune, RSD, has been steering the Senate toward classified briefings rather than public hearings. The argument from the Republican side is that open sessions could compromise ongoing operations, while Democrats argue the public deserves to know why the war is escalating without a clear exit.
It's a classic standoff over war powers. If the administration is operating on the basis of an imminent threat, as they've claimed, the Senate wants to see the intelligence that supports that, especially after Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard faced such intense questioning on the matter last week.
Ultimately, it comes back to the pump. When gas hits $4, the theoretical debate over war powers becomes a very practical debate over the cost of living. If the strategy doesn't stabilize, the political pressure on both sides of the aisle is only going to mount.
The Iran conflict dominated the morning, but as the session wore on, the focus shifted from international tension to a rare moment of domestic agreement. It was a brief pivot toward protection of a different kind.
Right. A look at how the Senate is trying to tackle a very different threat at home, with the move toward Tyler's Law and new fraud-fighting measures.
The atmosphere in the Senate did a complete 180 yesterday afternoon. We went from the high-stakes partisan back and forth over Middle East intelligence and war powers right into a moment of rare, quiet consensus. Senator Jim Lankford, a Republican from Oklahoma, stood up to ask for unanimous consent for S-921, which is known as Tyler's Law. It's a bill that's been moving through the committee process with surprisingly little friction.
And the reason it's moving so smoothly is rooted in a very specific, tragic gap in how our hospitals function. The bill is named after Tyler Shamash, a 19-year-old from California who died from a fentanyl overdose in 2018. When he was brought to the emergency room, the doctors ran a standard drug screen and it came back clean. They thought they were dealing with a different kind of medical emergency because, according to the test, there were no opioids in his system.
That is the detail that catches most people off guard. The transcript from the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee explains that the standard 5-panel drug screen used in most ERs tests for things like cocaine, amphetamines, and opiates, which generally means naturally occurring substances like morphine or codeine. It doesn't look for synthetic opioids like fentanyl, unless a doctor specifically orders a separate, more expensive test.
It's a quirk of chemistry with massive policy implications. Because fentanyl is synthetic, it doesn't trigger the same chemical reaction on those basic tests. So you have patients like Tyler who are in the middle of a lethal overdose, but the tools the doctors are using to diagnose them are effectively blind to the substance that's killing them. Senators Alex Padilla, a Democrat from California, and Jim Banks, a Republican from Indiana, teamed up on this to try and close that detection gap.
The bill passed by unanimous consent yesterday, Monday, and it directs the Secretary of Health and Human Services to conduct a 3-year study on how often these tests are actually being performed. But the real weight is in what happens after the study. The record states that the Secretary must issue guidance within 9 months on whether hospital emergency departments should implement testing for fentanyl or fentanyl-related substances as a routine procedure for patients experiencing an overdose.
Wait, so it doesn't actually mandate the testing? It just mandates the study and the guidance?
Exactly. And that was a deliberate choice to keep the hospital associations on board. A federal mandate for a specific diagnostic test can get very messy regarding insurance reimbursements and hospital autonomy. By framing it as HHS guidance, they're using the bully pulpit of the Department of Health and Human Services to shift the standard of care without triggering a massive regulatory fight over costs.
It's a softer approach, but once that guidance is issued, a hospital that doesn't test for fentanyl could face significant liability issues if a patient dies under their care. It effectively sets a new national benchmark. But while that was a moment of unity, the Senate immediately pivoted back into the trenches for the next item on the agenda, the confirmation of Colin McDonald.
This was the opposite of unanimous. We saw a 51-45 cloture vote yesterday to move forward on McDonald's nomination to be an assistant attorney general. He's been tapped to lead the brand new National Fraud Enforcement Division at the Department of Justice. It was a strict party line split, with Republican leadership, including Senator John Thune of South Dakota, pushing hard to get him through.
This new division is a major tell for the administration's priorities. McDonald is a career federal prosecutor from California with a background in public corruption. By creating a specific division for national fraud enforcement, the DOJ is signaling a shift toward more aggressive, centralized probes into financial crimes and, notably, election-related fraud. That's where the partisan tension comes from.
The roll call shows 4 senators were absent for that vote: Senators Ruben Gallego of Arizona and Chris Van Hollen of Maryland on the Democratic side, and Markwayne Mullin of Oklahoma and Tommy Tuberville of Alabama for the Republicans. Even with those absences, the narrow majority held. The Republicans are moving quickly to fill these DOJ roles, especially ones that involve investigative power.
It's interesting to see the contrast. On one hand, you have the Senate working in perfect unison to fix a technical glitch in ER drug testing. On the other, you have a 51-45 split over who gets to lead the hunt for white-collar and election-related crime. It just goes to show that consensus in the Senate is usually reserved for the problems that are literally matters of life and death, while the machinery of justice remains a primary battleground.
That battleground is only going to get more crowded as we head into the rest of the week. While the Senate focuses on these high-level appointments, the focus is starting to shift toward the consumer side of the ledger. We're looking at a series of hearings and floor statements that take us into the mechanics of everyday financial security.
The week ahead: scams and Social Security.
It's a bit of a split-screen reality right now. If you look at the extensions of remarks from yesterday, Monday, there's this dense list of committee schedules for Wednesday and Thursday. While the floor is dominated by those high-decibel debates over the DHS shutdown and the SAVE Act, the committee rooms are quietly pivoting to what you might call the anxiety economy.
That's a perfect way to put it. The Joint Economic Committee is holding a hearing Wednesday afternoon specifically to examine what the record calls the rising global scam economy. They're looking at modernizing federal approaches to protect Americans from foreign fraudsters. It's one of those rare areas where you see a total lack of partisan friction, because frankly, everyone's constituents are getting those same fraudulent texts and AI-generated voice clones.
The Commerce Committee is taking that even further into the digital weeds. On Wednesday morning, they're marking up S. 1885, which would require the FTC and the Surgeon General to implement a mental health warning label on social media platforms. It's a fascinating procedural move, treating a scrolling feed with the same regulatory logic as a pack of cigarettes or a bottle of cough syrup.
I'm curious to see if that label actually changes user behavior, or if it just becomes digital wallpaper. But that's not the only social media front. They're also looking at S. 3618, which is a bill requiring a report on how minors are accessing fentanyl through these platforms. It shows the committee is trying to pin down exactly where the tech company's responsibility begins when the global scam economy turns into a literal drug market.
And then there's the big one. On Wednesday morning, the Committee on the Budget is set to examine Social Security, focusing on a discussion on the facts and the path forward. In a midterm year, that's usually a third rail nobody wants to touch, but the schedule shows they're diving into the solvency data head-on.
It's the ultimate contrast. You have these public hearings on Social Security and social media, but then you look at the 1 o'clock slot for the Armed Services Committee, a closed briefing on Operation Epic Fury. The Senate is trying to project a sense of business as usual on the consumer side, even as they retreat behind heavy doors to discuss the ongoing constitutional tension with the executive branch.
The machinery is definitely grinding toward the elections. Between the scrutiny of the bulk power system and the posture of Space Command on Thursday, the Senate is filling the week with oversight that reminds voters they're still watching the store, even if the lights in the storefront are flickering.
It's a lot to track, but that's the Senate for you. Fighting over the big picture on the floor while checking the fine print in the basement.
That covers the highlights from the Congressional Record for Monday, March 23, 2026. We'll be back tomorrow to see how these committee plans survive the reality of the floor. For Floor Notes Extended, I'm Paige.
And I'm Reed. We'll see you next time. But before we actually step away, there's one bit of procedural gymnastics from yesterday's record that really defies the laws of political physics.
You're talking about Markwayne Mullin's very busy Monday.
Exactly. In the span of a single afternoon, he resigned his Senate seat, was confirmed by the very colleagues he was just sitting next to, and was sworn in as the Secretary of Homeland Security. He didn't even have to leave the building to change careers.
It's a masterclass in efficiency. According to the transcript, he went from the lawmaker asking the questions to the executive branch official responsible for a department of over 100,000 employees. That is quite the Monday evening pivot.
He basically just swapped his ID badge and kept walking down the hall. Although, figuring out how to pay those 100,000 new subordinates might be a slightly more daunting task than his previous committee assignments.
That's Floor Notes Extended for today.
Keep your eyes on the fine print, and we'll catch you on the next one.